But nowhere, based on those definitions that I just gave you, do we have evidence that crimes against humanity or genocide are taking place. Maybe both sides. Could you argue that war crimes have taken place? Maybe, but certainly the reports that I've seen don't say war crimes took place. They say mass human rights violations. So yes, so that's the truth that representatives, spokespeople for Russia, what they'll say, they'll mix that bit of truth with a lie that it's genocide. There's absolutely no evidence that genocide's taken place. If they have evidence, they should present it. They've never presented it.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, Worldview. At Worldview, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're chatting with Professor Alexander Hinton. He is a Distinguished Professor of Anthropology, Director of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, and UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention at Rutgers University. He is the author of over a dozen books, including the award-winning Why Did They Kill? Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide, and It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. Professor, good afternoon. It's so great to have someone of your expertise on the show. First question, I'm very interested to hear, how does one become an expert on genocide and why? Why did this particular field interest you?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and you're a remarkable show. I'm really delighted, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. That's a big topic in a certain way. My path to studying genocide and mass atrocities was not a direct one. I'm an anthropologist, and so in terms of my research, I wanted to study in a Buddhist country. One with an interesting history. And so I sort of narrowed it down to Tibet and Cambodia. And then, this was around the time right after the end of the Cold War. And suddenly, whereas the situation in Tibet did not get better in terms of doing research, it did in Cambodia. And they had an election. And I went in there, but I actually went in intending to study what's sometimes called ethnopsychology. It's a combination of sort of an anthropology of psychology, covering things like emotion, trauma, conceptions of self, things like that. But when I got there, the signs of the genocide that had taken place, I was interested in that, obviously, and trauma is an issue, really sort of took over my attention. And there are many different sort of factors, but people there sometimes, and they still say it to this day, would say, why did Khmer kill Khmer? Khmer or Cambodians kill Cambodians? And in many ways, sort of looking back, that question became my question for my dissertation research, and in certain ways, stayed with me very much into the present. And the first book I wrote, which you mentioned before, was called Why Did They Kill? And that echoes that question that I was asked. And that sort of set up, sort of larger questions about genocide. So if you're going to study the Cambodian genocide, at the time we had Rwanda was taking place. We had the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and of course the Holocaust, was sort of from the 70s on was getting an increased visibility and focus on it. And so I began, to study Cambodia, to, look at other cases and to understand comparative insights. And that sort of opened my path to becoming a comparative genocide scholar, as well as an anthropologist, someone who studies international justice as well. I won't go through the whole long history. That's probably more than enough. But I'll just sort of underscore with one point. I actually was, privileged to serve as an expert witness at a tribunal that was held in Cambodia, sponsored by the UN, the Extraordinary Chambers in the courts of Cambodia. And that was, going back to your original question, I was able in that forum to revisit and in a very public setting in Cambodia, address this question about why did Cambodians kill Cambodians. And normally we write our books and our articles, and there's sort of an audience for that. But many times the information and explanation doesn't circle back to the local level and the people on the ground in the country. So it was really nice to be able to sort of, go and share these insights. And there were ones that were informed by comparative genocide studies as well. I actually have a book coming out about that because I had an encounter with Nguyen Gia, brother number 2, in Cambodia. And I have a book, Anthropological Witness, that'll be out later this year that talks about the experience of testifying.
Hello, everyone. If you're interested in advertising on Worldview, drop us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com. We will send you an advertisement guide, which will include the rates and the process involved. A typical shout out for your company or project will be between 45 and 60 seconds. By advertising on our platform, you'll be supporting a company that wants to improve the public narrative. Once again, send us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com, which you can also find in the description below. Now, back to the interview. Wow, that's such a fascinating history. I mean, when you say you were an expert witness, that must have been an extremely stressful circumstance. Did you get a lot of pressure from both sides, or wasn't it that stressful?
Yeah, so now you've opened up the question of, the sort of book question. It's you're right on the mark. So I actually begin the book this way. I talk about so I testified in March 2016. And actually at the time, Donald Trump was a candidate for president. And I had the experience of testifying, and I actually was going to write about those two experiences sort of in tandem. And they split into 2 projects. And I published another book, It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. But these two things are kind of interwoven. But in 2015, I got a message from the court, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, saying, we'd like you to be an expert witness. So many people, this wasn't the case for you, and you correctly talked about the stress. Many people think, oh, great, you can testify and contribute to the process of justice, and that's all true. But as someone who had studied the court and done research on the court, and I published a book, Man or Monster, Trial of Khmer Rouge Torturer, about the first case in the tribunal. I was in the middle of finishing another book called The Justice Facade, about local understandings of international justice in Cambodia. And I'd interviewed many different people in and out of the court. But I'd observed sessions in the tribunal where expert witnesses had testified. And I knew that they were basically, the defense tried to tear them apart, unless it was a defense expert witness. Most of them were for more from the prosecution, maybe for the judges. But I knew that I would be, as I thought of it, in the hot seat, and that the defense lawyers would come and try and tear apart my research, my methods, my reputation, and I was aware of that. So, sort of waited and, had to weigh the factors. But, I said in the end, this sort of going back to what I said earlier, this is a way for me to sort of help make a small return to all those Cambodians who'd spent, I've interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of people in Cambodia. They've taken their time, talked to me, and shared their stories, often painful ones. It was a way for me to sort of make a return and contribute to the process of justice. So yes, it was 3.5 days on the hot seat, and it was definitely stressful. I was glad to sort of come out fine on the other end, but it did culminate with this exchange with brother number 2, where he was upset at my testimony and came up and posed a couple of questions to me, which I did not expect. But it's like, it was an extraordinary experience, right? If you think about encountering not Hitler, but Goebbels or someone like that, and having a courtroom exchange in Nazi Germany, this was the equivalent, right? There's Pol Pot and then Nguyen Gia, brother number 2. Pol Pot died quite some time ago. So he's the highest ranking Khmer Rouge leader still alive. And I should just put as a footnote for some of your viewers. So if you don't mind, just like a 1-minute explanation of the Cambodian genocide, because it used to be everybody knew what it was. But from in the mid what's called in the US, the Vietnam War, the conflict in Indochina. Basically Cambodia was heavily destabilized, and a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist-inspired group of revolutionaries called the Khmer Rouge began to gain numbers of people supporting them for different factors that I won't go into. US bombardment of Cambodia was one factor. There was a coup. But they took over Cambodia in 1975 in April. We had just passed the anniversary recently. And they tried to implement, and in fact, they did implement arguably the most radical socio-political revolution in history, and they radically revamped the country. So Cambodia had a population of about 8 million people. And in the course of I think I have this right, 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, I believe, I may be off a little bit, most Cambodians will be able to tell you that, most of the survivors, about a quarter of the population perished. About half of those were killed, and the remainder died of disease, starvation, overwork.
Wow.
So they were deposed in 79, and then it took many years to have a tribunal due to geopolitics. It used to be, if you look up, I sometimes tell my students, go look up they haven't heard of Cambodia, the top 10 most evil people, and I'm not giving much, credence to that, what have you, but it's just a point that if you look on that, Pol Pot always pops up on that list, and the students realize there's this figure in history they've never heard of, where many of have heard of Stalin, Mao, Genghis Khan, so on and so forth, and of course Hitler. So it's a really important moment in history, but those histories are forgotten by many at this point.
Yeah, it definitely is, but we have limited time, and I really want to. I have so many questions on this topic, the current situation in the Ukraine, and I know a lot of our viewers would love us to discuss this topic. So first of all, the $1 million question. I know this is probably that gets a lot of legal analysts and politicians and political analysts in trouble. Legally, what is a genocide, before we get into the general discussion of what's happening in the Ukraine?
Yeah, so, like all questions, that's a great question, but it opens up many different doors. We don't need to go down all of them. But a bit of backstory to the definition of genocide, I think, is necessary to sort of understand the way it's being deployed currently in Ukraine, and more broadly, with the Rohingya, the Uyghur, and other situations where accusations of genocide are being leveled and, in fact, recognized by different states. So the coin was termed. The term genocide was coined in 1944 by a man named Raphael Lemkin. And he was actually a Polish jurist who left during World War II. He was Jewish. Many members of his family died during the Holocaust, but his understanding of genocide was actually informed by historical cases. It wasn't a term that he coined amid what now we talk about as the Holocaust. The word Holocaust was not widely used, of course, back in the 1940s. It sort of came and arose as a term later. But so when the Armenian genocide was an important event for him, but many others as well. And so the definition of genocide that he coined, the sort of essence of it was he used the notion that all groups have a spirit, and genocide is the crushing of that spirit. And what that means is you can crush it by killing people, but you can also crush that spirit by destroying cultural institutions, by eliminating their ways of life, by targeting the sort of bearers of those cultural traditions.
That's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said that's very interesting. Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, so, that was sort of the essence, and it came from notions of German Geist. There's a whole sort of history to it. But so that was 44. He had sort of a first iteration of it in the early 1930s, and I think it was 1933 at a Madrid conference. So we get to 44, he coins the term amid the Nazi atrocities. And then we get Nuremberg. The term is actually sort of introduced into Nuremberg briefly, though it's not in, it ultimately was not one of the crimes that was found in the end, but it circulated there. Lemkin was disappointed, but he basically devoted much of his life to then getting genocide recognized as a crime. He sometimes talked about when he was in law school, and sort of famously he said to his professor, "Why is it a crime to kill one person, but it's not a crime to kill an entire group of people?" Right? So you have homicide, but there's no crime for killing a group of people because of the principle of sovereignty in part. And that was he wanted to criminalize it. And to be fair, I should say there are many other people that were involved in the creation of the UN definition, not just him, but he's the person who coined the term, and he was behind the scenes. He was working with many different people, but it was the UN. So, the UN had just been formed. And what happens at the UN when you want to get a convention or anything done, a declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was also being in committees. There's a lot of debate and discussion and argumentation and compromise that's involved. So we had this sort of singular definition of genocide that had the notion of spirit that was really a crucial part of it. And I should note that he also, amid the Nazi atrocities, viewed the erasure of the spirit of a group by the imposition of another group's modality of being as a part of genocide. And I mentioned that as well because that will tie back to Ukraine, and I'll revisit that then. But in the end, we got a sort of political brokered definition at the UN that was passed in December 1948. And it has this wording, and again, delegates argued for a couple of years, especially the preceding year, about every single word in this definition. But it was the intent to destroy, and the word intent is really important, especially for lawyers, and it's contested as well, because how do you prove intent? That's always the question. So it's the intent to destroy a group as such, and that sort of suggests because of who they are. It says in whole or in part, and there's a lot of debate about what exactly that means. So it doesn't mean if you have an indigenous group living, let's say in Brazil, as is the case, and let's say there are 150 people in the group, and you kill 15 of them, is that genocide? So there are a lot of debates that go on versus killing, 140 of the 150. Different debates, but there's a sort of question of numbers that's always in the backdrop. And then there be through political wrangling, Lemkin's definition, actually an early 1946 definition that was first proposed resolution at the UN, included, all sorts of groups, right? It was an attack on a group because of who they were effectively. But there was a bunch of debating and a lot of politics came in, and they narrowed it down to 4 protected groups, right? So national groups, though there's some ambiguity about what a national group is, racial groups, ethnic groups, and religious groups. So what was significantly not included, were political groups or economic groups. And the reason these things were excluded is because different geopowers didn't want them included. So Soviet Union didn't want political groups in there, right? They didn't want economic groups in there. They also took out, and there are some groups in South America as well, were adamant about that. In addition, they got rid of the notion of cultural genocide, which, as I mentioned before, was important to Lemkin because it was a critical part of the spirit of a group. They got rid of that because a number of colonial powers didn't want to be accused of genocide. And even the word intent was a word that deflected away from possible crimes of the major political powers. So for example, the US had committed atrocities against, and continued to do so afterwards, against its Black population. And it feared lynchings and other crimes would create a susceptibility, a possibility that they could be tried for genocide. And so you had this word intent was put in there, and now lawyers sometimes talk about special intent. But that creates a very high threshold. And again, the creation of this definition erases histories, it erases what many scholars would say are past genocides that have taken place, and it narrows down considerably, especially if you look at the definition of intent, right? If you have special intent, it narrows down the possible number of cases that can be folded into the legal definition. And so I always think it's really important to underscore that the legal definition is not the definition, it's a definition. And in fact, it's a definition that diverges from the original definition of the person who coined it, even as that person was involved in the creation of this legal definition. So the legal definition does a lot of good. It's great to have it, but like all things, it has shortcomings. And maybe the other thing to note is that there are 5 acts of genocide. So it's not just killing, but it includes things like the removal of children, right? And placing them in another context where they grow up having a different identity. And that was actually a remnant of cultural genocide in a way that was left over. So you can kill people. Another one is placing them in difficult circumstances that diminish the group, preventing reproduction within the group, which is why, like in the criminal tribunal in Rwanda, they found that rape was used as a tool of genocide. So there are 5 different acts, but everyone thinks of, typically, and sort of the way we think about it, with the metaphor of the Holocaust, Auschwitz, as industrial mass murder, and that's sort of the killing of people, but that's not all that's included.
Wow, that's so interesting. And yeah, I studied law, so the moment you mentioned intent, I was like, oh, that's going to be a problem. But so if I understand you correctly, if you merely had the intent, to some degree, you can be legally found to have committed genocide, or is there more involved in that? Or did I misunderstand you?
Well, you have to link the intent to the acts.
Okay, so that's the first part. Okay, now I understand you. Okay.
Yeah, so you have the intent. So, if you want to talk about, when I testified at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, this was an issue. How did you link Nguyen? And there was another Khmer Rouge comrade, Q Sampan, who was also on trial. This is what the prosecutors had to do. How do you prove we know the people died? We have lots of documents, but how do we sort of prove the chain of command and link the people at the top to the acts that are being committed on the ground? And that always is difficult because, of course, most genocidaires do not want to leave big paper trails, and they're also at a remove. So, sometimes they do it by talking about joint criminal enterprise, which is what they used very much at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. But that's always the trick. So in Darfur, when violence was taking place, there was an attempt to link the government to the crimes on the ground. And there was a UN commission that looked into this, and they said, well, we can't connect the two. We think it's possible, but we can't find it. So we can't say that genocide's taking place. But what happened then is everyone said, oh, genocide's not taking place, even though the report said we can't prove whether or not it's taking place because we can't sort of make this chain of command. We can't find the smoking gun, so to speak. So it's always the issue. So, in Ukraine, it's going to be the same thing with Russia, right? Can you find intent, and can you link it to the acts? Because intent is so difficult to find, one way with the courts have found that you can prove intent is by looking at patterns of behavior. You can infer it. So there is sort of wiggle room. What's interesting in the case of Russia and its invasion and mass atrocities committed in Ukraine is that Putin basically gave a statement of intent, right? He openly said, he has a long essay that he wrote, I think it was last year. It echoes things he's been saying for many years. saying that Ukrainian identity is sort of an imaginary construct. And in fact, Ukraine is part of Russia, and Russia effectively has claim to it. And through that, he talks about denazification and de-Ukrainianization, both of which could be taken as terms that are, the intent to obliterate a group because of who they are. But again, making the connections down to what's taking place on the ground, that's always difficult. But it is somewhat unusual to see such an open statement of intent given by a leader. But what he said now circulates in Russian media. There's some reports. And again, this is why it's really hard to say, oh, is genocide taking place? Because you're a lawyer, or you have a legal background at least, right? So right? You need to test the facts, to test the evidence, to determine facts, and it takes time. And so if people say, well, is it, by the legal definition, is it genocide? Almost any lawyer, most lawyers, actually, I know some lawyers who say it is genocide, but many will say, well, we need to gather the evidence, test it, determine the facts, and then come to sort of a verdict. But of course, that will take years. So that's this sort of paradox, is that determinations of genocide, if we adhere to strict legal protocols, they occur long after the violence has taken place. So this causes confusion. But if you do go and say you can infer it from patterns of behavior on the ground, that does open the door to saying, well, yeah, it looks like genocide may or may not be taking place.
Yeah, you made a very interesting point, Professor, where you said that the legal definition is not that important. Are you implying that sort of the opinion of in the public court of opinion is actually more important, that what comes across, the legal definition is always going to be interpreted different ways, but what the average person thinks is actually more important? What did you mean with that statement?
Maybe I misspoke, so thank you for letting me clarify. I didn't mean to suggest that. What I meant is that the legal definition is very important because it enables us to convict people of the crime of genocide. It's absolutely essential. I think I said that when I was talking about the UN Convention. That's great that we have it. But I noted it has shortcomings. And I think most lawyers would absolutely say that as well. Everybody knows the history of it, like all legal constructs, right? There's a history to it. They have shortcomings, but they also do important work. So it's fantastic, great, absolutely. In terms of international criminal law, we have, it's essential to have this. People sometimes say, well, why don't we try and modify it? And, that's like opening the door to losing it. So let's keep it, but we shouldn't fetishize it. We shouldn't sort of hold it up as the end all be all of genocide. We need to recognize that, first of all, there are other ways of defining genocide. And I mentioned Lemkin's definition. Many scholars, including myself, would certainly say that political groups, economic groups, should be folded within that umbrella of protected groups. In terms of thinking about genocide, it shouldn't be any sort of group that's targeted because of who they are. But we have the 4 protected groups, so law can do stuff with that, and that's fantastic. So if you ask me, well, is genocide taking place in Ukraine? Maybe you were planning to ask me that. I have no idea. But again, I'm not a lawyer, but I like to have information, and if we're looking towards a conviction, to sort of, I want the testing of the facts. But we can certainly say that we have a statement of intent. We have genocidal language that's been used by Russia. We have clearly, no doubt about it, war crimes that have been committed. So within international criminal law, people often will talk about atrocity crimes. And atrocity crimes include war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is not really defined in international law very well, but it's the forced removal of a population from a territory. War crimes refer to attacks on combatants or non-combatants right, during a conflict. So you think of a war crime, obviously the goal is to win the war, but in undertaking and carrying out the goal, trying to obtain that goal, let's say you capture POWs and you kill them or you torture them. And there's a long history of international humanitarian law protecting combatants on the battlefield. We've had reports of, of prisoners of war being killed. Again, how do we substantiate it? It's going to take time. But certainly all you have to do is look at the footage of a hospital in Mariupol being bombed, of apartment buildings with civilians being bombed, of educational institutions being bombed. There was one statistic that was like 70, 80 different healthcare facilities have been bombed, and there's indiscriminate bombing that's taking place. So I think there's no doubt that war crimes have taken place.
To play devil's advocate, perhaps Putin or his government can argue, okay, we released that statement and perhaps there's the intent, but the actions might show something different. You can say amongst the casualties, there are both Russians and Ukrainians. So we didn't try to eliminate the Ukrainian people. There are Russians killed as well.
Yeah, you're sort of one step ahead. So I was coming back to genocide. That was just war crimes. So that doesn't affect war crimes. In other words, intent is what you have with genocide. So we're talking about indiscriminate attacks during the course of a conflict for war crimes. Crimes against humanity refer to, they can be during war. So obviously war crimes are during war. Crimes against humanity and genocide can take place and often do during war, but they also can take place, as they did with the Khmer Rouge, during times of peace. So crimes against humanity, and these distinctions are important because these words circulate and a lot of people don't really know what they mean, how they differ. Crimes against humanity refer to widespread attacks against civilians. So again, it's kind of tricky. The law itself is a little, crimes against humanity isn't codified in a treaty, for example. But there is different law like the Rome Statutes, the ICC, and the International Court of Justice, where you have definitions of these things that are given. Also, different courts go and they make rulings that contribute to definitions. But it has there's this emphasis. So you could have attacks that are widespread against individuals with crimes against humanity. You don't have to have the intent with crimes against humanity, and you don't have to have that group identity. Genocide is distinct because you have to have the intent and you have to have the attack on the group as such. One thing that happens though is you often have these crimes occur in tandem, right? And you're often not totally sure when one or two are taking place. I think crimes against humanity almost certainly are taking place in in Ukraine, being perpetrated by Russia. And the question, going back to what you're saying, genocide, can you find the intent? And I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer. I do know that we have genocidal language and we have clear evidence that there are at least the sort of widespread attacks that take place with crimes against humanity. But do we have the sort of chain of command orders? Time will tell. But I should note, sort of going back to the fifth act, which is the deportation, forced removal of children, right? From one context, taking children to another context. And there are rumors, and they seem to be fairly substantiated, that there have been, thousands of Ukrainian children who've been taken into Russia. What's going to happen to them in the long term, what the sort of intent is, we don't know, but there are a number of different acts that, again, you have to sort of make these associations to come to that determination. But I think it's important in the end to also note that atrocity crimes in any form are absolutely awful. And we shouldn't think of, it's not genocide, therefore it's not that big of a deal. Committing war crimes is a big deal. Committing crimes against humanity is a big deal. And the international community agreed to this responsibility to protect. It's been used in not so good ways, like in Libya. It has shortcomings, but it basically was this agreement that all states are supposed to protect people and not harm people. And if they can't do it, the international community is obligated to help in whatever way they can. ideally not with military force, but it's an obligation. So the responsibility lies with each and every state. So atrocity crimes are awful. They're taking place. Is genocide taking place? Sort of depends on how you define it. We may not know for that legal definition for time, but it matters, but it also doesn't matter in the sense that horrible things are occurring. And there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, to give you the other side, I've recently, and I know you've written an article on this. I recently spoke to the press attaché to the Russian embassy, and he told me that one of the main reasons for invading the Ukraine was there were atrocities or even genocide committed on Russians in the eastern parts of the Ukraine, and the Russian government had to interfere because otherwise their people would have continued to suffer or even be completely exterminated. That's his opinion. Were there any real evidence of this, that Russians were really being mistreated? Or, I mean, I know for one example he gives is the Odessa massacre, where he says in the Odessa massacre, a lot of Russians were forced into a building. The building was set on fire, and about 40 Russians perished, died from the fire. So that's one of the examples he gave me.
Yeah. So these are standard talking points, and I think it's important that you brought it up. So, if you bring up the Armenian genocide in many contexts, you have Turkish officials who are trained to respond, and they always sort of come up with the same 4 or 5 talking points about it. So it's no surprise. I was on Al Jazeera, and there was a scholar who was just parroting basically the same sort of line that you just mentioned. So it's a bunch of talking points. Like all forms of denial, and this is a form of denial, they mix truth with lies, right? So absolutely, yeah, horrific attack was made in Odessa, and people were killed, Russian speakers. And again, Russians, the language there is, those are really Russians, right? Well, what does it mean? Do they have Russian citizenship? Well, are they ethnic Russians? Do they identify as Russians? Are they Russian speakers? So there's also ambiguity with that term. And at the time, the other thing is, Ukrainians are a bunch of Nazis, and there is a group that was operative in carrying out atrocities, a neo-Nazi group, just like Russia itself has neo-Nazi groups. They have white power groups. The United States has them. South Africa has them. They're all over the place.
In fact, I think you can say the 3rd or the 4th largest party in Russia is, to a degree, a sort of a neo-Nazi party.
Yeah, white power is another way to sort of think about it. So, so there's this talk about denazification. Well, look in your own country. You can look in the U.S., what have you. You've got lots of neo-Nazis. But actually in Ukraine, the power of that neo-Nazi party actually is greatly diminished over time. Anyway, so absolute horrific atrocity took place. That's not an act of genocide, though, right? And people should be held criminally responsible for it, no doubt about it. Just like in Donbas, right? And remember, Russia was directly involved in the conflict in Donbas, and almost everyone believes that they have had at the time troops that were fighting on the ground in Donbas at the time, and have continued to have it since 2014. We had this frozen conflict. I can't remember the exact numbers. Was it 13,000 people were killed, maybe 1.5 dislocated? And again, don't quote me on that. Everyone should be looking up and checking any sort of statistics that you hear anyone say all the time. So please check it. But I believe that was the sort of official figures coming out of the UN about the numbers who died. There have been international monitors who have looked to see if atrocities are being committed. And they said, yes, absolutely, both sides. We've had things like torture that have taken place, different human rights violations that have taken place. And again, on both sides, and I'm not going to get into who's done more because it's somewhat ambiguous. Some people say, well, it was the Russian aligned groups that were doing more, but we'll just put that aside. But nowhere, based on those definitions that I just gave you, do we have evidence that crimes against humanity or genocide are taking place. Maybe both sides could you argue that war crimes have taken place? Maybe, but certainly the reports that I've seen don't say war crimes took place. They say mass human rights violations. So yes, so that's the truth that representatives, spokespeople for Russia, what they'll say, they'll mix that bit of truth with a lie that it's genocide. There's absolutely no evidence that genocide's taken place. If they have evidence, they should present it. They've never presented it. And, if you want to think about the truthfulness of what Russia says, all you have to do is go back to the days before they invaded Ukraine. And what did they say? Oh, we're not going to invade Ukraine. They've been lying from start to finish. They've lied about Chechnya. They've lied about in Syria, Aleppo. There have been all sorts of atrocity crimes that Russia has historically committed, and they lie about it. Now, I freely acknowledge, and everyone should look at their own countries, and I've written about stuff that's occurred in the US. The US has committed atrocity crimes as well. But that's irrelevant to the moment at hand. We're talking about Ukraine and what's taking place there right now, and it's Russia that needs to ultimately be held accountable for what it's doing.
Yes, and I believe you mentioned in your article, even if the Russian government thought there were genocide being taken place in the eastern part of Ukraine, there were diplomatic ways they could have resolved that problem by presenting, for example, evidence in the UN or following UN routes.
Yeah, and so why didn't they do it? Because they don't have it. If you had it, you would present it.
And what were some of these routes they could have taken to resolve this issue diplomatically?
Well, of course, in a situation like this, diplomacy is what we all want, right? And no one wanted this to take place. And certainly there's a long history that led to this point. Sort of the larger arguments about why Russia invaded, some people say it's a larger sort of imperial ambition to go into all different areas near their borders. I'm digressing a little bit, and sort of take over areas that are identified as Russian, like what they say about Donbas. And I sort of circling around to a point you made, though, identity is fluid, right? Identity is something to which people identify with. And what Russia's done in many parts, I think, is to greatly antagonize and kill and abuse Russian speakers, even as people usually are bilingual, like Zelensky himself, and can speak both Russian and Ukrainian. But they've ironically gone in and harmed and abused many people whose primary language, they lean more towards being Russian speakers. So the sort of larger goals for the invasion, why they did it, you have to look at it historically, and certainly through this lens of imperialism, I think is relevant. And if we look at the lens of imperialism in world history, of course, it's one of the drivers of genocides that have taken place in a variety of different places. Anyway, so the long and the short of it is they could have gone before different. There already is a monitoring group, the OCSC, that's been monitoring for a long time. You could take something. There are different units at the United Nations, for example. You have the Human Rights Council. You have the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. You have a number of different entities that are involved, the Security Council, a number of different ways in which you can circulate and try and prove your case. You could take it to transnational human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty and try and make your case. And I should say they've also been monitoring the situation since 2014, and they've never found anything remotely resembling atrocity crimes. So there are many, many different ways you can do it. You could release a public report. I'd be delighted to read a report like that. There's no there, to quote Gertrude Stein. And so what happens is you get a bit of truth mixed with a lot of lies that are used to justify what's ironically, right, because they claim they were intervening to prevent genocide, and now they've gone and committed a host of atrocity crimes and dislocated over 5 million people. It's tragic. And I should note the tragedy, it's usually the people on the ground who suffer en masse, and it's not just the Ukrainians. Think of all the soldiers who were recruited in Russia from far away and sort of, told they were going to liberate Ukraine. And 25,000 people soldiers appear to have been killed. Certainly the numbers, I saw the number from Zelensky that only 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. I find that hard to believe. It doesn't really matter if you think about the numbers in Mariupol alone who died, tens of thousands of people, most likely in other places as well. So the leaders talk a big game, they start a big fight, and it's the little people on the ground on both sides who die in massive numbers.
Yeah, it does sound like a very strange way if you want to end atrocities or genocide. This is the way you want to do it. At least, or just be clear, what is your end objective? If that is your plan to end atrocities and genocide.
I think Putin told us his objective, which was to quote unquote denazify and de-Ukrainianize Ukraine and put in a puppet government that would be like Belarus. So, he told us, and they tried to do that. And again, there was incompetence and most likely disconnect. And I think in the years to come, we will sort of find out the inner deliberations and story of what went on. But there was something in terms of communication in the top levels of Russia. There was a real breakdown in terms of what they thought they could do and what took place, because they basically from different military experts who've spoken, what we saw transpire, what Russians themselves have said, it was an incompetent initial attempt to take Kyiv. And I expect there are going to be consequences, maybe for Putin, but certainly for people. And maybe we've seen those consequences, but there are many rumors that circulate about people losing their positions of power, so on and so forth. Time will tell.
Professor, I want to move to another topic that was trending before this took place, the entire Ukrainian war, and that is the situation in China in regards to the Uyghurs who are being deported, and some are saying they're being placed in concentration camps. So I know that the term genocide is very sticky, to say the least, but what do you know of the situation? Can you update our viewers what's going on there?
Yeah, so, in some ways, some people look at this as a situation of sort of imperialism, and it actually relates back to Tibet as well, where you have a number of ethnic Chinese who move into an area. But basically, if you go back to that sort of argument about the spirit of a people, the Limkin definition, and there are many different strands of this. Part of the history and legitimation of it links back to the U.S. quote unquote war on terror and the targeting of Muslim groups, in many parts of the world through this rhetoric legitimating, attacks on them. And China picked up on this. And there were some Uyghurs who've been radicalized, but in general, that's not at all an appropriate characterization. But through this discourse of fear of terrorism, of terrorists, there's been this attempt to basically, brainwash may be too strong of a word, but to purify the minds of Muslims, Muslim Uyghurs in China. And so, the numbers, again, how do you prove the numbers? There's pretty good documentation that, over 1 million people were rounded up and underwent this sort of political education to purify their minds. There have been attacks on cultural leaders, including anthropologists, actually, who've disappeared. And so more broadly, they've had many different claims. I think it's been substantiated. There's been forced sterilization. So there have been a number of different acts that together, people have made the claim that, genocide has taken place. There's an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. This is in part through, different acts, even if people aren't being killed en masse, though some people appear to have been killed, there are these other attempts to diminish, if we want that language, the spirit of the group. So people have debated this, and then, it's also the use of the term genocide is always political. people use it, as Russia did when they tried to falsely legitimate their invasion. As well, it's a term that casts, it can legitimate action. It can also cast aspersion. You can denigrate your political enemies, your political foes by using it. So it's always in that context. It doesn't always mean that you're misusing it, but certainly the US had many political interests in referring to what's taking place in China as genocide, which they have. There's also a great deal of academic scholarship which suggests that that's actually a correct label to use in this case. So I'd say the scholarly consensus is that a genocide has taken place, and there's a number of countries, including the US, that have called this a genocide. But of course, China itself, says that's not the case. And usually when a state's trying to deny that something's taking place, they will go to talk about intent and sort of try and have as high of a threshold to make a determination as they can. So the term becomes a political football.
And they're probably doing this to prevent a situation of a potential ISIS arising in China, to enforce cultural unity. That's probably their intent.
Yeah, I mean, that's their stated intent. And there's always potentially a grain of truth to that. And that may be part of their goal. But there's also this imperial goal to come in and to, as they did in Tibet, to exert control and to repopulate it with ethnic Chinese. In other words, so you're basically colonizing. It's like settler colonialism, which is a dynamic we've seen all over. And again, we see it with Russia. We saw it in the creation of the US. We've seen it all over the world historically. So I think that's a lens. It's important not just to look at it through that war on terror lens, but to see it more broadly in this history of imperial conquest, Chinese imperial conquest.
Interesting. Professor, this sounds like a very interesting book. It Can Happen Here, White Power and the Rising Threat of Genocide in the US. What does that book deal with?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. So, it goes back to 2015, right? I got the summons at the court. Donald Trump was becoming a viable candidate for presidency. I was, on the week that I testified in Cambodia, the meme, Trump is like Hitler, was the meme of the week. When the National Public Radio labeled it that, this analogy was going everywhere. There were fears of authoritarianism. As a scholar, I'm always very wary of quick, easy analogies. But certainly in terms of the demonization of non-whites in the US, and also non-white outsiders, including people, quote unquote, called terrorists. He referred to Mexican rapists, drug lords, so on and so forth. This language of insiders, outsiders, of a pure community under threat by a dangerous, contaminating outsider was very much being mobilized. Now, he wasn't the first one to do this. There's a long history of this language being deployed in the US, but Donald Trump is very charismatic. He can bring, crowds to a roar. He can inspire them. He's a very charismatic person. And that also was something that's very alarming to someone who studies mass violence and history. So he had some of these qualities and messaging that I found very alarming. And I said, well, I'll probably write about it. At some point, then he became president, of course, shocking many people. And then soon after that, we had Charlottesville. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Charlottesville. Do I need to tell the history?
You can probably tell the story.
Yeah, so there's a long history of white power extremism, white supremacy in the US, going all the way back to the foundations of the country. It's changed through time. I talk about this in the book. Especially after the civil rights movement, you begin to get notions of victimization and subjugation, and the notion of white genocide, which I know also circulates in South Africa as well, and often through the Great Replacement idea that we see in Europe in many different contexts. That language was certainly began to be more foregrounded. And there have been a number of white power militias. Timothy McVeigh blew up of an FBI building, famously modeling his attack on the Turner Diaries, which is people have called it white supremacist scripture. Anyways, I'm going to digress too much into a lot of this history, but we've had this long tradition of these groups being active. They, at different times, their numbers will increase and then decrease. And they actually increased greatly during when Obama was president in the US. Most people don't really know about that. So the numbers are already high coming in, but they also, a lot of these groups are really galvanized when Donald Trump became president, because he effectively was playing upon white genocide discourses, played upon white grievance, white victimization. And so, I don't want to say there's a moment of euphoria, but certainly elevated expectations of a number of these groups. So Richard Spencer, the person who coined the term alt-right, for example, he was in Washington at the time, and he did a Hail Trump salute that was, famously circulated around the world, I expect, in the media. So he was one of the organizers of a rally in Charlottesville that brought together, originally it was going to be the alt-right, and what we might call the far hard right, which are the sort of neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, and other actors. But we had this new group called the alt-right, a new term, and Spencer claims, sometimes takes credit for having invented that term. Their platform is that race is real, the Jewish question is valid, and the white genocide has taken place. They had a book that came out that sort of said that this is the essence of our platform. So they had this rally. The alt-right pulled out because I think the far hard right were involved, the most extreme elements, but still a number of white power actors, ranging from members of the alt-right to KKK and other white power actors showed up in Charlottesville, held a rally. One person was killed, and they had wiki torches they marched with. They chanted blood and soil. They chanted, Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, with that replacement language. And this was, a major event in sort of US history. And people suddenly said, what is going on? And at that point, again, I've been thinking about writing about this, this language of white genocide, the language of race war, the echoes and mobilization of Nazi language were such that I said, I'm going to write about this, and I'm also going to teach about it. And so the book actually is written in sort of a temporal progression, and it sort of tells the story of my teaching and thinking through the events that were taking place in the US. And I should note that the worries back in 2015 certainly began to seem much more warranted and alarming by the time we got to 2018. And at that point, I had a class I was teaching, Genocide and Mass Atrocity, and people used a UN framework of analysis that looked at risk factors for genocide. And students were working with this risk assessment platform. And after a shooting at a synagogue, Tree of Life massacre in the US, we said, well, let's take it and apply it to the US. And it was fairly alarming that actually the level of risk of atrocity crimes in the US was relatively high already. And those risk factors only amplified and hyped up as we moved to 2020. And they were sky high by the time we got to the January 6th insurrection in the US. And the US was on the cusp of atrocity crimes if things had played out in different sorts of ways. So the book follows, it looks at the history of white power extremism in the US, systemic white supremacy. It looks at the immediate history of how this manifests under Trump. It looks at how political leaders mobilize language like white grievance, victimization, to stir people up. It also considers social media which is an absolutely critical factor in the ability to, to mobilize people. Also, for people are in these, the famous bubbles, but it's true. Left, right, or center, people are in these bubbles where they hear the messages of what they sort of believe about the world, and it's a real problem. I myself always try and listen in the U.S. It'd be Fox News, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, what have you. I always try and look at a spectrum, including some fairly far-right sites as well. And everyone should be doing that. And I always tell my students to go do it, because the messages, this is one aside. So in the US, until we recently had this R.V. Wade controversy that broke out with the Supreme Court a couple of days ago took place, if you turned on CNN or MSNBC, Ukraine was the story. If you went to Fox News, the war wasn't in Ukraine, the war was on the border, right, with illegal immigration. That's the war. So there's like these completely different understandings of what's going on. And of course, you think about threat. In one case, it's Russia, sort of through this Cold War geopolitical threat lens, danger of nuclear war. And another one, it's this great replacement fear of non-white others coming in and taking over the US. And, there's a daily occurrence. So again, the book considers the sort of thought bubbles, how people, sort of get caught up in the rhetorics of white genocide, great replacement language. And it's not a small number of people. I should note that there are a number of different studies, but we're talking about tens of millions of people in the US. If they're not necessarily members of the far hard right or the alt-right, but they're people to whom that message, with whom it resonates. And that's highly alarming. And what it means is basically the US, I would say this is actually true in many different countries. You can actually even look at Germany, for example, where they found that there's this high proliferation of neo-Nazi sympathizing officials, in the police, and the different parts of the government. I mean, most people aren't aware of this, but it's widespread. It doesn't mean everyone is a neo-Nazi, but it's this, right? These rhetorics that resonate with people. And so, what's the situation in the US now? We're still not in a very good situation. There's an enormous amount of polarization. We have the specter of the charismatic demagogue, Donald Trump, returning. He's been banned from Twitter, but he has his own social media platform now, Truth Social, and we'll see if it works. But we'll see if Elon Musk continues and buys Twitter, and if he does, if he lets Trump have his 80 million Twitter followers back. Twitter is astounding how Trump was basically a master of Twitter in the way that he messaged and communicated with people. Anyways, these are all things I consider in the book. I've gone on too long talking about it because it's still a fresh project and very directly relevant, not just to the US, but to white power extremism in the world. And I do talk about these sort of global circuits of white power extremism as well.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. Donald Trump has said that even if Elon Musk offers him to join Twitter again, he says he's not going to do it. He's going to stick to Truth Social, or at least that's what I've heard.
Yeah, you're right. That's what he says. He wants to make money.
Yeah, Professor.
So that's his platform, so he can make money off it. But I guarantee you, if his platform doesn't do well, he'll grab onto Twitter and use it.
Yeah,
I have no doubt about that.
Professor, have you read True Believer by Eric Hoffer, where he talks about the psychology of mass movements? It's a very interesting book, and obviously, okay, you also know it, that where he talks about it's intellectuals that usually pave the way for a mass movement. For example, he cited Germany, where he says that it's a person like Ludendorff and the Kaiser Wilhelm that said the reason why we lost the First World War was because of Jews. And that sort of energy led to the rise of a person like Hitler. Hitler didn't create the situation, he merely harnessed it. And it doesn't seem to me there's a similar situation in the United States, to the same degree. So I know, for example, you mentioned Charlottesville, but were there only 1,000 people that were so-called Nazis that attended that event? And I think after George Floyd was killed or murdered, there was a poll that showed 70% of the people in the United States support Black Lives Matter. And of course, anyone who believes one race is less than another race, that should be condemned. But it just doesn't seem to me there's that same sort of something that can lead to a Holocaust that you saw in pre-Nazi Germany.
You know, that's a great point and a sort of big issue that you bring up. And again, I don't want to give a long answer to it, but I think it's important to underscore, well, first of all, that white power extremism is global, and the thought leaders are in connection with one another. They're in the US, there's a stereotype, sometimes we talk about this as Southern exceptionalism, where the portrayal of far-right extremists is that they're from the South, they live in rural areas, they're not very intelligent, they're kind of backwards. This is absolutely nothing to be further from the truth. The white power extremists, I'm in New Jersey, where Rutgers University is located. We've got lots of white power extremist groups. I could drive half an hour and I'd be in sort of right by one of the major ones in New Jersey. They're all over the place. They're intellectuals who lead the movement, who produce ideas. I mentioned before, I don't want to mention the book because I don't really want to recommend it to anyone, but they published a manifesto. And the people who wrote in this manifesto of the alt-right were people who had advanced degrees. They are the intellectual leaders of this movement. And there are many other people with whom they now communicate, interact throughout the world. So absolutely, white power extremism definitely has thought leaders. You can look at, in the US, at the sort of conservative movement, and you can find many highly educated people. I don't want to say conservatives, but people who had sort of far-right extremist, white power extremists valences to what they were talking about. You can find a number of highly educated people who were promoting this. So I would say absolutely the thought leaders are there, and they're very much in the center. In fact, one of the sort of concepts that they pioneered, this guy named Overton, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Overton window, but it's this idea that you need to shift the boundaries of what's acceptable speech so that what formerly was taboo becomes acceptable. And under Trump, so people, the far-right intellectual leaders, white power extremist intellectual leaders, talk about this idea of shifting the Overton window. And they did shift the Overton window. They talk about, and this is global, the notion of metapolitics. The idea of metapolitics, there's a belief, and again, so far-right extremists read the Frankfurt School of philosophy. They think that they're a bunch of quote unquote cultural Marxists, right? So they're reading philosophy, critical theory. They're mobilizing critical theory. And one of their key beliefs is that actually you had the Frankfurt School with Adorno, Horkheimer, and these other philosophers who were Jewish, most of them, that they wanted to basically brainwash people because often it's a Jewish-led conspiracy that they believe is behind the attempt to eradicate the white race, that tried to do thought control and make it so people couldn't have sort of extremist beliefs. So if you want to teach people about tolerance, that's a modality of thought control and brainwashing for white power extremists. So they said, well, we're going to engage in our own metapolitics, and we're fighting a battle for minds ultimately. And so we have to do things like shift the Overton window and to take ideas that have been tabooed and banned by quote unquote cultural Marxists and make them acceptable. And you know what? Under the Trump administration, they moved the Overton window. Trump himself moved the Overton window. And so if you sort of look, in the US, and, this is true globally, I think, with what people can say, we can just look at the great replacement discourses that circulated in the French election. Out in the open, front and center, right? Which they used to be taboo. Marine Le Pen's now a moderate, which is shocking, right? But anyway, so I'm digressing, but the point is that this window has moved and the boundaries of what it's acceptable to say has shifted in the US. And this also lays a sort of basis in the future for future dangers of white power extremism to again sort of rise up and increase the danger of having political violence, civil war, mass violence. It's not to say it's going to occur tomorrow, but it's there. That potentiality is there. And the one other point I would underscore, again going back, is that the US has committed atrocity crimes. Most of US history involved the enslavement of Blacks. US history involves the dispossession through settler colonialism of indigenous lands. US history includes the concentrating Japanese Americans, right? And basically concentration camps. US history, I could go on a long time. Guantanamo, war, imperial wars, there's a long history of atrocity crimes. So the idea that there's a possibility that atrocity crimes can take place shouldn't be surprising. They have taken place. And it makes it incumbent upon all of us, wherever we live throughout the world, with all of our different histories, to continually be aware and on the look for signs that something that, this sorts of violence might take place again. That's maybe we kind of come back full circle to the beginning of our discussion, where this is why it's important to understand what these things are, right? When we talk about genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, to understand the definitions of the concepts, to understand the dynamics and drivers and the risk factors for them. Because if we're not watching for those, right, then this stuff comes out of the blue. So that's, you sort of say, maybe your very first question was, how did I start to study this stuff? And I sort of talked about that. And this is where I am now, where I'm trying to mobilize this knowledge in part for prevention and to write publicly about things that are often written about in smaller sort of academic scholarly circles, and to take these ideas and communicate them. And you mentioned before, so during this, recently I published 2 articles in The Conversation and an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about this immediate, the Ukraine, atrocity crimes in Ukraine. But it's something that I think most scholars, we need to be writing in general about. So I write about it in the US, I'll write about it in Russia's atrocity crimes in Ukraine, and I will continue to do so in the future in other localities. And I encourage everyone, wherever you are, study this stuff, be aware, and also spread awareness.
Great. And that's such a great answer. I never know the detail of how far the Nazis would go to persuade people to join their cause. That's so interesting. But yeah, Professor, I see we're well over our time. This has been, thank you so much for your time. This has been such an interesting conversation. I want to give you one last opportunity if you want to add something, plug something, or just answer a question you hoped I would ask you.
No, you've asked many good questions, and the rule of thumb, is usually don't go over an hour, and we've exceeded an hour. So I think it's a good moment to draw to a close. And I just want to thank you for inviting me on, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you, Professor. To our viewers, you most certainly enjoyed this content, so please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald. You've been watching Worldview.